So today we're going to start talking about the first reaction of photosynthesis called the light reactions. Obviously, what do you think is involved in this reaction? Light. Okay, that's why they call it the light reaction. So here's photosynthesis, kind of an overview. Okay, we saw this equation before. Now we're going to really dissect and understand what this equation means. Photosynthesis is able to take carbon dioxide, water, and use energy to convert that into, what's this molecule again? C6H12O6. It's glucose. Okay, that's when you're... Again, I'm not going to say you should remember this or memorize this, but just the fact that we talk about it over and over and over again, you will. Okay, so that's glucose. Okay, it's a pretty important sugar. And then we have free oxygen that is produced by the reaction. So that's the equation written in its very simple form. Now, I'm not going to make you guys remember or understand why we have these prefixes, or they're called coefficients actually, like 6, CO2 means 6 molecules of carbon dioxide. But the equation is balanced, which means we have the same number of atoms on both sides of the arrow. If you were to count them all up, you'd have the same number of carbons on the left side as you would the right side. So this process is really just rearranging the atoms, making bonds, and that's why we need energy. So it can be divided into two main stages: the light reaction, which involves light energy. Light energy is converted to chemical energy, uses water. All right, so water is a reactant in the light reaction. And then the Calvin cycle, which we'll talk about later, is we store the energy that we convert in organic compounds like glucose, and we use carbon dioxide for that. One of the big things you guys are going to have to do in this section is be able to trace where the molecules are going, or where the elements are going, like, and where they came from. For example, like the carbon dioxide that contains the carbon, well, those carbons end up, they start over here, they end up here. Overall, it's pretty simple to follow. Where it gets difficult is the oxygens. Where does this oxygen go? Does it go in here, or does it go here? Where does this oxygen go? Is it part of glucose, or is it part of the oxygen that's given off? And we'll talk about those today in the light reaction. Now, just like any chemical equation has a rate, okay, any chemical reaction has a rate as how fast it proceeds, photosynthesis is affected by three main things: light intensity, more light, more energy available; temperature, again, temperature is just how fast molecules are moving. Temperature also affects enzyme activity. If it gets too hot, the enzymes stop working. If it gets too cold, the enzymes stop working. And then water availability, because water is a big-time reactant. I guess technically carbon dioxide availability also will affect the rate, but why do you think we don't worry about carbon dioxide very much in photosynthesis? Why do you think carbon dioxide is not really going to limit the rate at which it can proceed? Anybody? Fernando?
Isn't just carbon dioxide being released when the reaction happens?
Well, actually, oxygen is released. Carbon dioxide is what goes in. But where do we find carbon dioxide on this planet?
The atmosphere.
Yeah, the atmosphere. It's all around us. There's no place you can go really where you wouldn't have carbon dioxide, unless you go underground or some isolated cave or something like that. But CO2 is always available, so it doesn't really impact the rate. I guess in controlled experiments it could, but in real life situations, it's not going to have a real big impact. It's always there. So here's kind of an overall image of how the reaction happens. What's this big picture representing? What cell organelle is this? It is labeled. It's a chloroplast. And inside the chloroplast, we have these structures called thylakoids. They look like little green, I always think they look like little green coins stacked on top of each other. This is where the light reaction takes place on these thylakoids. And then the Calvin cycle happens in the liquid part of the chloroplast, which is called the stroma. It's just a dissolved soup of enzymes and nutrients, and all the things that are needed for this reaction to take place are just in this liquidy part of the chloroplast. What I also like about this picture, we'll come back to it, it shows you what's going in, water, CO2, and what comes out, oxygen and sugar. But it also shows you how we have ATP and this new molecule, NADPH, involved, and how light reaction produces it, Calvin cycle uses it and sends it back. So the light reaction begins with the absorption of light on the thylakoid membrane. So those green little stacks inside the chloroplasts, on the membrane, just like a cell membrane, they have these pigment molecules that contain chlorophyll that are just absorbing light. Remember, pigments absorb light but also reflect light. So what color light are the thylakoids reflecting? Green, absorbing all the other colors. So the outside of the chloroplast, the outer membrane of the chloroplast is actually clear. It's these thylakoids inside that are green, because they're the ones that have the pigment, they're the ones that are reflecting green light, but more importantly, they're the ones that are absorbing the other colors of light, like reds and oranges and yellows. So the whole purpose, I guess the overall function of the light reaction is to convert solar energy, light energy, into a chemical form. So the light reaction is an energy conversion process. You take light energy and you store that energy in the bonds of ATP, we've learned this one already, adenosine triphosphate, and NADPH. Does someone want to look up on Google right now what NADPH stands for and try to pronounce it? Yes, very good. Now you're going to have to memorize that, just like you had to memorize ATP. I'm just kidding, no. Who would want to say that over and over and over again? That's why we call it NADPH. Okay? But it does have a real long, confusing scientific name. We're just not going to really worry about it. Now these two molecules, the ATP and NADPH, are what are going to power the synthesis of sugars in the Calvin cycle. So basically a light reaction is just converting energy for the Calvin cycle to happen. In fact, the Calvin cycle used to be called the dark reaction because it doesn't need light directly. But it's kind of misleading because it doesn't happen in the dark. It just doesn't need light. It needs the products from light reaction to work. Again, this process all occurs on the thylakoid membranes, those little green coins inside chloroplasts, and it's chlorophyll A that's doing the main job of light absorption. That's the main pigment molecule found in chloroplast, chlorophyll A. There's also chlorophyll B and other pigments called carotenoids, these guys down here. They assist chlorophyll A. So I always like to think of it as kind of like a big satellite dish. You give all these pigment molecules collecting light, whereas the very focus of that satellite dish, where all the signal comes in, is where chlorophyll A. That's the main pigment molecule. So, there are two of these things called photosystems involved in the light reaction. And a photosystem is just a collection of molecules, a collection of pigments basically, that are all working together to absorb as much energy as possible. And scientists have so far discovered that there are two different systems involved, and they just call them Photosystem I and Photosystem II. And they named them basically on when they were discovered. There's no rhyme or reason to why it's called Photosystem I, other than that that's the first one they found.
Let me guess, it's really complicated.
Yeah, we're not going to get into how the photosystems are built and what they look like. We're just going to call them Photosystem I and Photosystem II. Basically, all you need to know is that Photosystem I has a molecule of chlorophyll that's absorbing light. It's called P700 because it absorbs light best at 700 nanometers. That's the wavelength of light that it's good at absorbing. Whereas the other photosystem is slightly off at 680 nanometers, a slightly different wavelength. Again, not that important, though, for your understanding. That's more of an AP level concept. So for us, it's just Photosystem I, Photosystem II. Now, what these photosystems are doing, they're basically absorbing light energy, and that energy is going to be transferred to electrons. If you think back to our model of an atom, remember we have, if you look at the nucleus of the atom, what's the nucleus of an atom? What two subatomic particles?
DNA.
Oh, you're thinking of a cell. Nucleus of an atom. I'm talking chemistry.
Protons.
Protons. Right, so protons, the neutrons are in the nucleus, and then whizzing around the outside, you have those electron guys flying around the outside. You guys learned about the atom in middle school, right?
Yeah.
Okay? So basically what's happening is that in the atoms that make up chlorophyll A, light energy is coming in and energizing those electrons, giving those electrons energy. So that's what's happening. Light is just energizing all these electrons that are found in these photosystems. So let's take a look at first at Photosystem I. The whole purpose of Photosystem I is to generate ATP. It's taking light energy and storing it in the bonds of adenosine triphosphate. So how does this actually happen? What's actually going on? Well, the light energy is going to be transferred to an electron. And so light energy hits the atoms of chlorophyll A, the electrons get excited, and the electron actually is able to leave the chlorophyll molecule. It's able to actually break away from the nucleus and leave. It has so much energy, it's now able to basically resist the pull of the nucleus on it and go to other molecules. Where that electron goes is to a series of basically proteins that are called electron transport proteins that make up what's called the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain, or ET, I often call it the ETC, is really a series of chemical reactions that we're just not going to talk about. But if you look at this picture here, here's an electron. It's just been excited by light. And what it does is it goes to this protein, and then this protein, and then this protein, and then this protein. It just kind of gets passed along. It's kind of like the old bucket brigades that used to pass buckets of water when they were trying to put out a fire. From one person to the next, the bucket just got passed. But remember, this electron has energy. And so that energy, every time that energy or energized electron gets passed, it gives off some of its energy. And that energy is actually used to actively transport hydrogen ions, which we can also just call protons. Because after all, hydrogen is just one proton and one electron. Well, if we ionize it, we take away its electron, all that's left is a proton. I like to call them protons. What starts happening is that we start pumping protons inside these little thylakoids. Those little green coins are actually hollow on the inside. And we start filling up this thylakoid space with these protons. Here, I'll color them red. So there's a proton, there's a proton, there's a proton, 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 proton. And so basically what this electron is doing is like turning on these pumps. And those pumps pump protons, and we start filling up the inside of our thylakoid with all these protons. All right, how many people's heads already hurt? Yeah. Okay. This is tough. I know this is tough. We'll cover this several different ways, and it'll eventually get easier. I really think we have some animations we'll show you too that make it a lot easier to understand. So in that thylakoid, we have this high concentration now of protons. We've been actively pumping and filling that thylakoid, that little hollow green disc. We've been filling it up with protons. And what do they want to do? What's one of the things we've already learned about the way molecules like to move? They want to diffuse. They want to spread out. They don't want to be in a high concentration. They want to get away from each other. But they can't get across the membrane by themselves. They have to get across through a special enzyme called ATP synthase. It's like this channel that is the only place that those protons can leave. And just based on its name, the fact that we call it ATP synthase, what do you think this enzyme then does? What is it going to make or synthesize? ATP. I always think of ATP synthase as like a water wheel. Like those old-fashioned water wheels that were, all millers used to have. People used to mill corn and grain. As water flows over the water wheel, what happens to that water wheel? It spins. And as that water wheel spins, that generates energy. And that energy is used to mill whatever needs to be milled. Or it's how we make hydroelectric power these days. We send water through turbines, and those turbines spin really fast, and then that generates electricity for us. Well, in a plant or in a chloroplast, the ATP synthase is like that water wheel. But we're sending not water across it, we're sending protons. Protons flow over that water wheel, spin that water wheel, and out cranks ATP molecules. So we have this flow of protons through the ATP synthase, and that flow couples the reaction of how to add a phosphate to an ADP, and you just recharge your batteries, basically. Now, since this is called cyclic electron flow, what does it mean to be cyclic?
It goes in a cycle.
Goes in a cycle. So the electrons that were excited from chlorophyll A, they've been being passed down this electron transport chain, they go back and return to where they started. And get just re-excited again. Go down the chain, and then go back. Get re-excited, go down the chain, and then go back. So it's just constantly energizing electrons. Electrons pump protons, and the protons flow to produce ATP. And so we're cranking out ATP molecules. Here's kind of a visual. Don't worry about the FD and the PC and the cytochrome complex. Those are all names for the electron carriers. what happens, here's our photosystem. See, it's just a collection of pigment molecules. So light hits that photosystem. The electron gets excited, gets passed down the electron transport chain. In doing so, we get ATP made. By that whole process of pumping protons, they diffuse out, turn the water wheel, and crank out ATP molecules. But this is the idea of why it's cyclic. It gets excited. Oops, let me go back. So let me draw in here an electron. So in here we have electrons. I'm going to write it as an E minus. Once light hits that photosystem, we have an excited electron. So I put quotes around it to make it excited. You can put little stars around it if you want. Ooh, we're excited. That excited electron moves down the electron transport chain. In doing so, that energy that it gains from light is used to drive the production of ATP. It's actually called chemiosmotic synthesis. Well, what do you guys know about osmosis? It's the movement of water across a membrane. But why is this technically not true osmosis? Are we moving water across a membrane? No, we're just moving hydrogen ions. We're kind of moving like half water. So they still use the word osmotic, but this just stands for we're moving hydrogen ions, protons, across a membrane. But still works the same principle. High to low concentration, it moves that way naturally, but we use that flow of energy to drive the production of ATP. Again, why is it called cyclic? It's a cycle. The electron returns to where it started, just to get re-excited again. So we kind of have, as long as we have light energy, we have this never-ending source of ATP molecules. As long as we have batteries to charge, we can charge them, as long as we have light. Because the electrons never get used up. They just keep on getting re-excited and do their job to recharge those ATP molecules. Yeah?
So the protons are like the ones traveling in the cycle to like make the ATP, right?
Right.
So when you say like the excited electrons, I'm confused where like the electrons come in.
Okay, I know that we have a lot of things moving here. We have electrons moving and protons moving, and it's confusing. So think of the electrons as they're think of them basically as energy. They're energy. Technically, they're not really energy, but just for right now, think of them as energy. And so here's this energy-rich electron, and think of these purple boxes and circles here as like pumps, and those pumps have an on-off switch. Typically, they're off. When the electron encounters the pump, it turns it on. And that pump pumps a hydrogen into the thylakoid. The electron moves to the next pump, turns it on. Pumps hydrogen into the thylakoid. Moves to the next pump, turns it on. Pumps hydrogen into the thylakoid. So you build up a high concentration of hydrogen in the thylakoid. So basically the electrons are there to create that high concentration of hydrogen ions so that they'll flow out, and you'll use that as energy to make ATP.
Okay.
Does that make a little more sense?
Yeah.
So, before you really understand the nitty-gritty details of what we just talked about, you really just first have to understand what goes in, what comes out. What goes in to the cyclic electron flow is light. One light event. Light hits photosystem I. We also have ADP. I guess technically what else should we put there? If ADP is going to make ATP, what else do we technically need? A phosphate, an inorganic phosphate. You need the battery to recharge. But all that comes out is ATP molecules. Not to say they're not important, but that's not the full equation of photosynthesis. We've just got one little intermediate that's going to be used up eventually. So one light event, light energizes electrons, electrons move, turn on the proton pumps, protons get pumped in, Protons then flow out through that special channel, ATP synthase, and that recharges your ADP molecules into ATP molecules. So as long as the lights are on, you should have a full supply of ATP because you're constantly recharging them. So NADPH has an electron, the high energy one that was excited by light. NADP plus is an empty truck, waiting to pick up electrons. So again, very similar to the cyclic reaction. Light energy is transfer of electrons. Electrons leave chlorophyll. Okay, I'm kind of down here right now. So electrons leave chlorophyll, travel on the electron transport chain, but they don't go back. They get carried away by NADPH. That truck drives them away from the reaction. So what's the problem? What's the problem with photosystem 1 now? It doesn't have its electrons anymore. It lost electrons. Eventually, it'll lose all its electrons. If we keep exciting them with light and taking them away by NADPH, we'll have no electrons left. That's where photosystem 2 comes into play. The missing electrons of photosystem 1 are replaced by photosystem 2 by a fairly similar process. Light hits photosystem 2, excites an electron, goes down the electron transport chain. That produces some ATP for us. But then it replaces the missing electron in photosystem 1. But now what's the problem? We're still going to run out of electrons because photosystem 2 will run out.
Photosystem 3.
Nope, there's no photosystem 3 that we know of. Maybe there is. Maybe you'll discover it. We'll call it the Teddy system. So where do we get those electrons? How do we replace the missing electrons? Well, that's where water comes into play. Let me skip over this. The missing electrons from photosystem 2 need to be replaced. And so what photosystem 2 does, it has a special enzyme that's able to split water. Okay, and this is like where plants have like the biggest, or I should say photosynthesis has the biggest like evolutionary front-running lead on all other life, is that they can harness light energy to make chemical energy because they can split water efficiently. Okay, we need electricity to do that. We use electricity to split water. Plants just use this enzyme. Okay, that releases oxygen, which is great for us. We breathe it in and use it all the time. But more importantly for the plant, it replaces those missing electrons. Basically, it takes the electrons out of water. Photosystem 2 is then replenished with electrons, and the process can continue. We can keep on exciting them, passing them over, exciting them, and taking them away as NADPH. So as long as water is available here, photosystem 2 can work, therefore photosystem 1 can work, and we can keep generating NADPH. We're going to need NADPH for the Calvin cycle later on.
This is kind of off topic, but where does the carbon we breathe out come from?
We'll get to that when we cover cell respiration. So it's on topic, but just for another day.
Fair enough.
You're confused enough right now, I think. So, overall reactions, we're going to kind of end here today. We're going to draw on this. Here's non-cyclic flow. So let's start where the electrons start. So if you were an electron, this would be your journey. You would start off in water. But then water would be split. And you would be passed to photosystem 2. Now here's where the naming of photosystems comes into play. It would make sense, to me at least, that this would be named photosystem 1. But it's not. And from what I've read, it's because it was discovered after photosystem 1 was discovered. And so photosystem 2 comes first in non-cyclic flow. I know, it makes no sense. But that's the way it is. So here's the electron. Light hits the photosystem, gives you lots of energy, you get excited, and you enter the electron transport chain. You get passed down the chain, and as that happens, you give off some of your energy. That energy is used to make ATP. That's done through the pumping of protons into the thylakoid. The thylakoid then is full. The protons want to move out. They move out through that ATP synthase, turn that water wheel, and crank out ATPs. That's really not that important, though, right now, because we're following what's happening to this electron. So by the time you get to photosystem I, you're exhausted. Oh, you've used all your energy up. So what has to happen? Light has to come in and re-energize you. You get re-energized. You go back into a different electron transport system. But in this time, you're not making ATP. Oops, where my lines go? You're not making ATP. You're being taken away by our NADPH truck that carries you away off to the Calvin cycle.
Brain cramp.
Now, when I come back on Tuesday,